Welcome back. This week we are in First Corinthians chapter 8. And in this chapter, Paul is giving the Corinthian church advice on eating meat, and specifically meat that has in some way been connected to the idol worship of the various shrines in and around Corinth. So let's give you some background on what this situation is and why Paul addresses it. First, to say why Paul addresses it, it is likely that the Corinthian church mentioned this in a letter, that they had disagreements over whether or not it was appropriate to eat this meat. And so they mentioned it to Paul, asking him for guidance, some sort of pastoral guidance on this matter. It is also possible that Paul just heard about this from another traveling preacher, that the people in Corinth were having this dispute, and that he felt that it was necessary to write to them on this occasion. So the background of this is probably that they've had this ongoing dispute about whether or not this particular meat is sinful to eat, and then they in some way have asked Paul to render judgment for them. Now, it is important to note that the word that Paul uses for this meat sacrificed to idols is only used a handful of times in the New Testament, and it might actually be a word that was coined by Christians to distinguish from the temple gifts, the right temple gifts, and gifts to pagan deities. There's some similarities to another Jewish word that is used to talk about the sacrifices that the priests were allowed to eat. And so this is probably something relating to that, but we don't know exactly what it means. It is possible that it simply means any meat that is associated with idol worship. The temple areas, the shrines, these pagan shrines would have also been the butchers, the local butchers, and any meat that people would have gotten, any meat that they would have eaten, came from these shrines. So just like maybe 50 years ago, you would go down to the meat market and you would see hanging in the meat market, you would see some carcasses, and the butcher would have cuts laid out in front of you in the case, and you'd pick up the cuts that you wanted and take them home. Well, that was very similar in towns or cities like Corinth with large number of shrines. The difference is these would have been attached to pagan temples, and that the meat sold by these butchers would fund the pagan temple in some way. And so the discussion is any of this legitimate? Is it right to eat this meat even though you're not participating in the sacrifice and in the ceremony that is associated with the shrine? Or is any semblance of participation is giving money over to this pagan shrine, participation in the worship of these false deities? And that is very much what Paul is trying to deal with here. It's also worth noting that this particular word is used a couple of times in Acts, and in relation to the Jewish church, the church headed by James in Jerusalem, sending a letter abroad, sending it with Paul to say that this type of meat is forbidden for Christians. They are not to use or participate in eating this kind of meat. And so the people in Corinth would have had that instruction probably, that if you eat this meat, you are in not in good standing with the church. And so we have to really gauge Paul's words here, because he seems to show a lot of sympathy for those people who want to eat this meat, not just in 1 Corinthians 8, but in other places in Corinthians and in Romans. He kind of goes against the church's decision, the Jerusalem Council's decision, in saying that this meat is not inherently wrong, it is not inherently sinful, and says to the people, go ahead and or you can eat it, but he takes the approach differently, not that you don't eat it because it's inherently sinful, but the reason why you don't eat it is because of your weaker brothers and sisters. Now, these terms strong and weak are also interesting because they relate not to an individual necessarily in their faith. It's not that these people are strong faith or weak faith, but what he associates the strong with are those who lean more on their freedom in Christ, where the weak are those who lean more on doing what is holy or righteous for God. So the person who is strong, he might be buttering them up somewhat in using the term strong to say to them, to kind of appeal to their sense of pride that, hey, you're the strong one here. You're the one who can lift up your brother or sister in this time. And to the weak person, he's saying, um, your your uh, your faith in some ways is simply a product of needing more support from the letter of the law. Where the other person needs less support from the letter of the law, you need more support from the letter of the law. It doesn't mean that their belief in Jesus is any less or their belief in God is any less. It's just how they interpret it. But it might also be Paul buttering up the side that he is then going to tear down a little bit. It's also important that the terms weak and strong might also have a socioeconomic idea behind them too. The strong could be completely associated with the rich, the wealthy, who are more accustomed to eating meat, more accustomed to having contact with the the different religious shrines and temples in the city, and the weak might be associated with the poor who would never have been able to find or buy meat, so that would not have been part of their diet. The idea of a strong person might be the rich person who has all these social ties, which in that time frame, social ties funneled around the religious world. So these shrines, these temples, that's where you went for birthday parties. That's where you went for um, celebrations. That's where you went for work. That is where you networked people, kind of like how churches have developed in our modern times. These third spaces where people interacted. Well, the rich of the community would have more reason to be involved with those places that was not necessarily religious, where the poorer people might not have the same opportunities or the same reasons to go to these spaces except for religious devotion. And so part of what Paul might be dealing with in this background is he might be saying to the rich, hey, you have all of these reasons to be at this temple that aren't inherently religious, but remember the poor people whose only contact with these places is for religious ceremony, and how your actions and attitudes impact them as they think about these spaces. There's a lot that could be in the background. There's a lot of mystery here. We don't know exactly what Paul means and what he is dealing with when he gives his advice, but we do see that his advice to the Corinthian church does not deal with the letter of the law. It doesn't deal with what the people know, at least not as far as general knowledge. Instead, he deals mostly with how the people relate to each other and how the people interact with one another in their lives. That to him is far more important than what the people know. For him, true knowledge is that intimate knowledge between people, and it's in building up those relationships that we truly display our Christianity, not in what we know about our beliefs or having the right beliefs. So this is the one time that we can definitely see Paul doesn't care about what we would call doctrines or beliefs. He says, how do those beliefs impact the people who are in your church with you? Because how those beliefs impact the people in your church with you is far more important than just holding to the right beliefs. Anyway, I hope that makes sense to you. I hope that you enjoy 1 Corinthians. As always, if you have questions or comments, I'd love to continue this discussion. So please reach out to me. And until I see you again, God bless.